Well, there we go. We just got the session started. Give everyone another minute or so. I'm Brian Herr. I'm going to be the moderator of this session. We've got some great guests on today, so we're going to be working our way through it. While we're getting people, basically a moment or two to come in, we are going to do a little bit of housekeeping right up front. Just for those of you that are joining right now, we are not going to do a death by PowerPoint session. This is a true roundtable. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Very spirited discussions have led up to this session, so I think it's going to be enlightening for a lot of people, and we'll kind of go from there. While we're giving everyone that moment, we are going to be doing quite a bit where we're going to break the session up and try to keep it flowing. So if you do have questions along the way, fantastic. We love questions. If it works within the session, go ahead and put it in the question window, and we'll keep tabs on that as we go. If I can get that into the flow of the discussion during the first session, fantastic, we'll go from there. If I can't quite get it to slide in there seamlessly, then we're going to go ahead and save it for the Q&A session. A little bit more of the head end here. We're also going to be doing a little housekeeping on the first session being recorded. So if you have objections to being recorded or anything of that note, this would be a time to jump, catch the recording later. When we do the recording, we will release the images later. We'll make sure that there are no traces of your names as part of the recording, right? So this is, obviously we all work in a world of privacy, so we want to make sure that the recordings are available to the few people that were not able to join due to conflicts. We have a few people that have requested a recording because, well, they'd like to be able to check it out a little bit later to refresh some of the topics that we go through. And then we'll kind of go from there. The Q&A session, we're going to do under Chatham House rules. And what's going to happen is as we go through the session, at the end, we'll make sure the Q&A session is cut from the recording so that we're not sharing any information you don't want. We want to make sure people are comfortable asking good questions and getting some straightforward answers, which is going to be fantastic. Another bit of housekeeping is that this is not legal advice. This is a forum of us talking about our experiences and how we've been able to make our way through different incident response investigations and really how we've helped other organizations. If you do need some legal advice, I highly suggest contacting your lawyer or Patrick. We've got him here. Great resource. So with that said, I'm going to do a quick roll call here. As I mentioned, for those of you that joined at the top, I'm Brian Herr. I'm a field CISO with Mainline. I've spent many years as a security officer and a privacy officer for a couple different companies. And as part of that, not only did I have to defend the company I work for and help them through their journey, but also I had teams that did investigations and incident response. So I've had both sides of the table for experience, which makes it very interesting. As mentioned, we've got Patrick Burke here. So he is with Phillips Nizer, a privacy lawyer and also former New York regulator. We have Dimitri, so he is a co-founder and COO at Atacama. We'll get into that a little bit here, but for those of you that know Atacama, definitely know how it works with the encryption and some of the frictionless access for users when it comes to encryption. And then we got Gabe Gumps. So Gabe, Chief Innovation Officer, Spirion. I'm a big fan of Spirion. I've known you guys for a little while, and fantastic what it does for those of us that are helping people in the privacy journey and also using some of the data as part of our security program. So with that, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to go and kick it off. We're 5 minutes in. We are, like I mentioned to some of those that joined earlier, we're not going to do death by PowerPoint. We're going to get right into the heart of it. So with that, we're going to kick it off. Patrick, we've all been through different incident response and investigations. And I'll tell you, it's always been a tough time when I've helped some of my clients. And what I found, really, most people don't know when to disclose, if they have the right things to disclose, are they in the right when they're disclosing to regulators? They just don't have the right data or what data was affected. Right. And this is something people have a hard time with. What have you seen when it comes to when to disclose and if people actually have the right data? In other words, do they know what data has been exfiltrated or somehow some bad guy has gotten a hold of it?
Right. Well, I'll tell you, I've been on the other side of that phone call, being at the New York State Department of Financial Services. So when we've had, and I've, instrumental around the cybersecurity regulation and the examinations for that. I had an examination team that did just that. But when there was a breach, they had to report. They had to report within 72 hours of becoming aware of it, and they had to get on the phone with me and a team of people. And what I can tell you is that at the 72-hour point, most people reporting don't really know much about what went on. They know something happened, or else they wouldn't have gotten on the phone. They may not have known what it was for a day or two. So their 72 hours. Question is, does it date from when they first figured out something was wrong, or when they actually figured out that they had a breach that they had to report? So the first issue is time. It's how quick can you get your answers together. And as a regulator, every state has data breach laws. So they're all wanting you to report when there's a data breach that involves citizens from that state. So one of the first questions that I, as an outside lawyer, have when I'm working with a company is, do you know what data they reached? Like, which data was affected by the breach? And then we have to figure out what jurisdictions those people's data come from. Are they from New York? Are they from California? Are they from a lot of different states? Are they from a lot of different countries? Are they from Europe? If they're from Europe, then it could implicate the general data protection regulation over there. So the first questions are about, like, what happened, and typically you bring in forensic experts who hopefully have been around your network before, but they may not have been. So it's an advantage when I'm a lawyer coming in and I see a forensic expert who actually has spent some time with the system beforehand. And also when they have software that is keeping track of which kind of personal information is being kept where, because then they can say, all right, this has been hit and we know what's in there. Because the process of learning what personal information and where did it come from is in a particular place that was attacked by hackers is like the key information that these regulators want to know. So how do you know that, and quickly? That's, and my other question is it encrypted? So if you're concerned that there's a big database with a lot of people's names and personal information in it, and that it looks like the hackers may have gone there, then was it encrypted? If it's encrypted and the hackers are not able to, they're able to acquire that, say, but they weren't able to acquire the key to the encryption, then under New York state law, for example, that's not considered a breach of private information because it is unusable to the hackers. So those are my initial questions, and they're all driven by timing. The other, aside from data breach, a lot of companies have contractual obligations to report the breach of any data that's been trusted to them by another company. If you have a customer, they've given you some data to work with, and now it's been breached, you likely have a contractual obligation to let them know about that within a certain amount of time, and you may have liability for it. So again, the question is, you don't have to report that to those folks if it actually hasn't disappeared. You may want to call them and tell them, you may have to read what the contract says. But if you can find out what the information was or what it wasn't, you're ahead of the game.
That's fantastic. I've had that discussion. Usually when you're on the investigator side, one of the quickest and most difficult questions is what data is affected. Because even if the investigator is able to pinpoint particular files or objects in a database or what have you, they don't necessarily know what the data is. And, so my past as a security officer, that's one of the things that we had to be a custodian of. We had to have knowledge of what data we had, where was it, and where did it go. And then this also as a privacy officer, this is where security and privacy overlap. And it's a tough discussion because it's very fluid. Users are moving data around, things are moving in and out of the company. You've got all these different pieces, and it's a tough problem to solve. This is where you have to have tools that honestly give you what you're looking for. I need to be able to look at whether my privacy data is, tag it accordingly, do things like that, and that's tough. That's really tough. And that's one of the first things I tell people is if you're doing an investigation, your investigator is going to tell you eventually like what files were affected, where did it go, what happened. They won't know what's in it. But you should know beforehand, because if you're in that 72-hour, if you can pin and say, I know that these files left, like this is what the hackers got, this is what left, you already know what's in there, and you can start your whole process accordingly. But that's the tough part.
We have some instances where we actually do the equivalent of an electronic discovery investigation after, because we look at different servers or machines or folders that have been accessed, and we have to have reviewers look through them and read what it is and figure out what it was that got stolen. So to the extent that you can get ahead of that game and know whether or not it's personal information, which is something you can search for and identify in advance, then your legal issues start to narrow. You start to figure out what it is you got to report and what you don't have to report.
Yeah, one of the things I hear a lot is, well, DLP will catch it. Well, the problem you run into is DLP is not necessarily a good safety net. Some people don't have it at all. Some people have patchwork of it. But if you don't have the data consistently identified and somehow, painted or tagged, it doesn't work. You can't make all of your systems work correctly because you're all over the place in your identification. And if you have an insider threat, that lack of DLP, like, okay, that safety net may not work. And this is where it gets difficult. So Gabe and I we were talking about this a little bit ago. It's tough to, especially as someone that's in the privacy side, to get a real good assessment of what data is where, because it can be anywhere. And now we're mobile. My biggest concerns used to be what was on servers. I really am concerned with what's on laptops now because they're everywhere. People are working from home.
That has and continues to be one of the single largest challenges is in understanding that breadth of unstructured data everywhere. The work from home situation has exacerbated that. The fluidity with which business needs to continue to move, it always has, that's kind of picked up a bit as people are now remote. But it also means that simply trying to apply one big security control to all the data doesn't really allow for what you just pinpointed, right? Which is what data is where, and then we can protect it in such a way that if it were to leave the organization, it does not have that same impact.
That used to be one of the toughest things because there's so many places for data reside and it's very dynamic. And, those of us that were, early days of privacy, we try to do this by hand, right? We'd fill out the DPAs and figure it out. For those of you that know, users are not good about tracking their data. They have no idea where it goes. They use it. They may not know or be able to interpret the data correctly. That's always one of my biggest fears is, you go through, you do all of the right things, and then there's the insider threat, the accidental threat. Someone sent something they weren't supposed to because DLP didn't catch it or whatever. You have to know where this stuff is, and it's almost impossible without the right tools, because that's the biggest thing I run into is a lot of tools are in this spot or that spot, and you have to kind of correlate all those things together. But ultimately, the one thing I can say is consistent. anyone who's in this industry long enough, right? You always hear that it's not an if, but a when. That's the reality. If you're in this industry long enough as a security officer, a privacy officer, a lawyer, right? Thank goodness the lawyers have a tough job because they're stuck in the middle of all of this. But ultimately, we're the data custodians. If we're the organization, we should absolutely know what data we have, where is it, and where is it going. Part of the administrative side, but also looking at, an incident. Like, we need to be able to turn around and give good answers in that 72 hours.
Right. Well, but the lawyers have another advantage that they can confer, which is
something just happened to my
Can't hear you now.
Yeah, still out, Patrick. Wow, it's just a mind-blowing topic. It just blew out his microphone.
yeah, but now
There's a lot of static. It sounds like there may be something obstructing the microphone.
why don't you go on without me? I'll see if I can log in again.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll have we'll keep going around. Patrick, we'll come back to you, give it a moment for your audio to stabilize, kind of see what happens there. But this is the crux of the problem. We need automated tools to figure out what data is where. But ultimately, this changes things. So if I'm Patrick, right, we were talking about this. Let's say I'm the person in charge of an incident for a customer, right? So this client is now saying, okay, I've had an incident. A lot of people they jump to the breach conclusion, right? You do have to kind of assume that that's in there, but if you can take a catalog of the data that was affected from your investigators and definitively say what did and didn't leave, I think it changes the game. Like, intellectual property has certain implications, privacy data, other implications, health data, European data, all of them have different implications, but ultimately you have to make those decisions by actually knowing what data you have. And Patrick, have you ever seen a case where basically, people found additional data was involved that they really probably should have known up front when they disclosed?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that can happen all the time, and it happens more frequently with companies that don't have, and this is going to sound very old school, but informational governance, right? Where they have a record retention policy, and they have a policy where they actually get dynamic about it and throw things away when they're no longer needed. So it's actually tracking blocks of data and getting rid of things in a supervised way. And if you can do that, you have a lot less surprises, because otherwise people don't naturally get rid of anything, get stuck somewhere. So it also can drive, if you have even a pretty rudimentary privacy program, you're going to start to pay attention to when new sources of personal information kind of come into the system, and where you put it and how you protect it, and giving the least amount of, we call it least privileged access. So only the right, people get access to it. It just means when there's a breach, you know a lot more about where things are. You get a lot fewer surprises. And if you do things like classify your data, you go that extra step. Well, now you're really moving into the big time.
And that's the biggest thing, is most companies are horrible at classifying the data and then aging it out appropriately. I mean, we had a session where we were talking with Gabe on this very topic. So we were basically making our way through saying, okay, most people, it changes the world. Like, we've all heard about various breaches that are out there where the old data, if that had been disposed of, like identified, and then disposed of properly, it wouldn't have been a case. There was nothing there. But this is key. You actually have to have a program that works, that understands retention schedules. This is where it gets interesting, right? this is the basics. You have to have a program. Technology can only do so much, but the technology has to fulfill the requirements of your program.
Right? And hopefully people just become more aware of where data is. You know, the silver bullet is really if the hacker comes in and it's all encrypted. You know, and they try to take those things away and do things with them and steal them, and all they get is gobbledygook. You know, that's fantastic.
Well, and to take that a step further, I've had cases where people ask, like, oh, but the hard drives were encrypted. Well, the bad guy didn't come in and steal a physical hard drive. That's not it. They're stealing data. And this is where it gets interesting, because most people they're very selective about their encryption. I mean, this is part of the foundation of how we got to this discussion.
Mhm.
People are not good at doing it themselves. And we're talking about, okay, so let's say I have a good governance program, I've got my policies in place, I take those policies and actually move it over to Spirion. So Spirion goes through and maps all the data, sets tags, you know, applies some policies here and there. But the kicker is, that's great. Hopefully DLP catches it. But at the end of the day, we need to encrypt it. And this is where I see things happening. I think the world is moving where identity is moving closer to the user, and policy and encryption is moving closer to the data. And the stuff in the middle is kind of the open ground. You're seeing that with the SaaS platforms, whatever. That's what I see happening. But this is where I think encryption changes, because now it needs to be user friendly. It needs to be frictionless. You hear about this a lot with, you know, the DevOps side, but in general, our world is getting where security should be less friction. And the platform itself, so I do all this tagging and everything. And now the next thing that needs to happen is I need to move it to a system automatically and encrypt it. And that's hard. It's hard.
The friction, I think, is still one of the significant challenges in applying security controls, right? Applying the right control means ensuring, again, you're reducing that friction, not just to the business, but to the users themselves. And so if we were to say blanketly, literally encrypt every single thing in the environment, part of the challenge we have there, especially as businesses move to more models where they are monetizing data, it does make it difficult for that data to be used by other human beings and systems. And that's not to say that information shouldn't be encrypted. Of course, we take that stance that information should be. It's about applying that right control, that encryption control, to the right information at the right time and making sure it's equally available. And to your point, the only way that really happens is knowing what that data is. Do you understand the type of information that you are trying to protect? Do you understand where it is, et cetera?
Yeah, and you can't take the model of encrypt everything and let God sort it out. It just doesn't work in today's world. You have to be intelligent. You have to identify it. You have to apply some kind of policy to it based on what you tagged it as. And then you have to apply encryption correctly based on your risks, your regulatory and legal obligations. But this is where I say you need to get people out of the middle. You need to push from one platform to another and then make it so people can just jump in and use it. Because otherwise, encryption is just going to get in the way.
Well, and I think a lot of security professionals, unfortunately, fall into the trap of checking the box. And not just when it comes to encryption. I think when it comes to their entire security program. And if you're checking the box for the sake of checking the box, you run the risk of situations where when an event does happen, and you're right, it's when an event happens, not if it happens, because there will be an event, some event. It doesn't have to be an outside breach, right? There's data loss in all different, ways, right? And so if you are just going through perfunctory steps and saying, no, to your point, we had the, hard drives encrypted. Or, no, we had this policy in place, but nobody was actually supervising to ensure that the policy was properly followed and meaningfully being implemented across the organization. So if you're going through these various steps and you're saying to yourself or to the board that you're reporting to or to whomever you may be reporting to, no, we've done everything that we're required to do in accordance with our systems. But if you're not really testing those systems to ensure that they are actually meaningfully being implemented, and are you meaningfully providing value add within your organization? The analogy that comes to my mind, hearing this discussion is really car manufacturers. if you think about that, right? What does car manufacturers have to do with what we're discussing here today? Car manufacturers are in the business of transportation, right? Getting from point A to point B, right? That's what a car is designed for. But the secondary characteristic of a car is to ensure the safety of its occupant, right? And car manufacturers have done a tremendous job in making those safety, right, features be as transparent as possible and really not impacting the core use case, which is getting from point A to point B. But in the event of a catastrophic event, those cars do their job really well, right? And they do it really well because there's thought behind it, because they're not just implementing a seatbelt and an airbag. Those seatbelts and airbags are deployed in a certain way, in a certain series of events if catastrophe were to strike. And why I'm raising that analogy, to me, when you're building a proper security platform, a security process with procedures in place and policies that need to be followed, you shouldn't be building them with the end game of what happens if I am hacked? What happens if there is a catastrophic event within my organization? You should be building it with security in mind at every stage, right? And it's not just the outside threat, it's the internal threat, right? And it's the combination of, the potential loss, right? And so if you're doing things in a meaningful way, if you're deploying those systems meaningfully, you will achieve actual security. And if you've done that, that breach event is going to take care of itself because you have all the pieces in place. You've got all the slots covered. And you're not just checking the box for the sake of checking the box. You've actually deployed something within the organization that you can point to, right, categorically, and say, no, I know exactly what happened because I have these systems in place, I have these processes in place, and they're being followed. And I'm checking up on them regularly to ensure they're being followed, right? So it's a grandiose statement for sure, and it's very difficult to implement it that way, but you have to start somewhere. And going back to where I started, which, if as a security professional, you're just checking the box for the sake of checking the box, when that catastrophic event happens, you will not be in a position where you can get your arms around what's going on, where you can report in a timely manner, where you can tell the regulator, I know exactly what was lost and the type of information that was lost, or whether you've actually protected yourself, right? The simple analogy of a hard drive encryption versus actually encrypting data in a way that provides true, meaningful security around the information, vastly different concepts, right? And so, at the end of the day, having those systems in place is one thing. Having those systems in place with a way that you can check to ensure that they're actually meaningfully being deployed and followed, that's a whole different, ball game. And that's what's going to get you ultimately to a position where you can deal with those, intrusion events.
I do appreciate the car analogy for a number of reasons, but one in particular that really stands out as well is car manufacturers began their security journey as having that kind of mandated by them, right, at the federal level. You have to install seatbelts, et cetera. But then the more progressive car companies took that and started making it a differentiator for their business, the Volvos of the world. Right. And then it became that security was a selling feature. And I think we see that in today's business also, where as organizations start embracing security and privacy of their users, especially in a world where every day there's yet another data breach, et cetera, we see that as being a differentiator between where people trust organizations to do business. And as you build those programs, it shouldn't just be ones where you're just checking the compliance box. It should be building it in such a way that is actually adding additional value to the business. With regards to just checking the compliance box, here at Spear, we've done some independent research recently ourselves. You were talking about data retention, and a couple of things really jumped off the page at us, right? So somewhere around 15% of the organizations that we surveyed out of almost 300 had no data retention policy whatsoever. But of those that did have a data retention policy, over 40% of them were deleting data just through attrition based on their backup schema. So they were holding on to things, holding on to all of the things, and only getting rid of it as their backup schemas kind of dictated some of those things roll off, but not necessarily based on regulatory needs, For that, we saw a much smaller number. It was about 10% doing it based on regulation. And then we saw even fewer doing it based on whether or not the data was sensitive and not being used. So, these are still areas of improvement that businesses can take to get rid of data. We talked in a different session about other ways to start moving data into more secure environments as they're making their way through their life cycle of existence. And deletion isn't the only mechanism for that. That is one area where encryption plays a very key role. Hold on to the data as is necessitated by regulation, but secure it in such a way that it is not wholly accessible to everyone. Simply moving it to different tiers of backups, which we saw another 20% of folks still using tiered backups as a mechanism for that, which was just staggering. But simply moving it to different tiers of backups is not a sufficient way to secure it and or preserve its privacy.
It goes back to the heart of it. Good data management and good just general IT and data housekeeping can avert a lot of risk. So there's something to keep in mind. Really, we're talking about an investigation or a potential breach, but ultimately we're using a lot of the same tools and the same data that you use administratively to do good hygiene, but also post-incident, that same data now comes in to save the day so that you know whether or not if there's certain files left, was there data that was private or had certain regulatory overhead on it. You could give good, honest answers to the leadership and your lawyers or regulators. Having a good, solid program is fundamental. Doing the good hygiene is fundamental. So I'm gonna flip this around a little bit. So Patrick, I'm gonna take that same scenario, right? We've all seen variants of this play out, but ultimately, let's say you have a client and they give a good retention policy. So most of the things that need to be cleaned up have been cleaned up, right? They've used a product like Spirion or what have you, kind of personal Spirion myself, but you're using something to catalog what data is where, what needs to be expired, right? Using those tags accordingly with different products and platforms. The client can display that their DLP solution, if it's an insider threat, where it's deployed would probably catch it. But in the case where it gets sidestepped, the investigators say, we know what files left. Some of it had intellectual property, which has certain implications, and certain files did have privacy data. And then based on that, we can tell there's New York, California, European, what have you, right? So we're changing it. But the platform, another platform came in and automatically encrypted it. And we can prove based on policy that either those files tried to leave, but policy kept them from leaving, either DLP or access policies for something like encryption software like Atacama, or some of them did leave, but we can prove empirically that the keys are still in house, keys have not been used, and ultimately there's been no request made to unencrypt it. So basically we can prove that the data went out and essentially is encrypted garbage. How does that really change your conversation with the client?
That changes everything in a very pleasant way, because I'm going through the set of risks with them, and what I'm hearing is that the only thing that there's still investigation going on about where the bad guys went, or maybe that's done. So we have information on where they got around to, and we have information on where their most valuable PII is, and that the only PII that left was encrypted, and they weren't able to take the key, and I can go have lunch. It's in terms of legal obligations, you're actually looking really good. I mean, you should call your insurer anyway, just because you always should when there's an incident, because there may be some costs you want to get covered. But you may not have to call any government officials. and say that any personal information was taken because it was all encrypted, and that you have good confidence in the kind of information you're getting about where different types of valuable data sit, and you don't really have to worry about it. You want to fix the breach. You want to make sure it doesn't happen again. If you can figure out who did it or how they might have been motivated, great. But you probably don't have to report anything contractually to customers if you can't see that any of their data that you're holding for them was taken in an unencrypted form. You may contact them and say, hey, we had an incident, but it wasn't a breach. And it wasn't a breach because we have really good systems in place and it worked. So that's probably good customer management to do that.
Yeah, it's all about trust. I mean, as security, privacy, and legal practitioners, it's all about trust. Our organizations we've been given the keys to intellectual property that we need to keep for the company. We need to be able to handle incidents accordingly and properly. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of stress. And most importantly, the private data. This is trust from individuals. This is data that identifies a person and can be used on so many different ways. And that's trust that just can't be broken. So the idea is you have to know what you have and where it is, because you need to be able to treat it accordingly. But I've had some of those conversations with leadership teams where they didn't know what they had. The data went out the door. There was a long forensic process to back into what went where, what was in it, brought in third parties to do the forensic analysis of what data was in there. And now we had to split it apart. And it was not a fun experience. And I'll tell you right now, having an incident or a breach is not like getting a virus. You don't build an immunity to it. You try to get better, but you can get hit multiple times. And that's a problem. So you need to make sure that your programs, your technology, your processes, all of that actually lends itself to assuming that you're going to have an incident. Something's going to leave, accidentally or otherwise, because it's a tough conversation. And I don't wish it on anyone, but we've all been doing this long enough. We know what's going to happen. It's probably going to happen multiple times. But I would love to be in a position to talk with you, Patrick, and say, they got in, they did stuff. We know what happened. We know what data left. We knew it was encrypted.
Right.
I think we're going to be okay
Hopefully
versus
you have
the
that
alternative.
conversation with me while you were still figuring it out, in the beginning. And then, what I'm going to want to know is, okay, what tools do you have? You've been mentioning Inspirion. What information can it give us quickly? Can it tell us, can we refer to it right away and say, oh, bad guys look like they were in this sector of the network. What kind of data is there? Will they know that right away? And will they know which was encrypted right away, so we can start knocking possibilities off as they develop? Is that the kind of information you get from Inspirion?
You cut out there. You cut out there for.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I was asking Inspirion, like if I was called in the first 10 minutes of this, what kind of informational help am I going to get from the fact that they've had good practices and they have Inspirion and maybe Atacama?
It's a good question. So, one of the things that the best time to have an incident response plan is before you need one, right?
Yeah.
And so immediately the first thing that you will get is a complete accounting and catalog of all of the different data types you have inside of your environment and all the locations within where they exist. So both across structured, unstructured, semi-structured, on-premise, in the cloud, wherever data exists, we will have a full accounting of what that data is by data type and the different tags as well, to the different sensitivity of that data. The combination of that with Atacama will equally then allow you to know where all those are, as well as what's protected, how it's protected, and where it's protected. So if, for example, you did have an incident whereby I'm defining an incident as, just kind of any observable malfeasance, if you would. You could with confidence state that, okay, this machine was compromised, but on this machine, we didn't have anything that was found to be sensitive. Or by inverse, on another system, we have these different types of sensitive data, whereby maybe we had financial data into PII, but both of those data types were encrypted without a comma, and the rest weren't. So you get a full accounting of, here's what I know explicitly, even if the system were to say be physically removed, to someone's point earlier, if it were a laptop that were lost, or if it was a system that was taken offline, or forget that. Let's take the ransomware problem that is just rampant across healthcare today. First of all, you wouldn't have that problem with the combination of Spear and not a comma. That's another use case that we can press on a bit further. But you'd have a full accounting of exactly where everything is and how it's protected.
So you'd have that in the first day, first 24 hours.
You'd have that in the first few minutes if the system had been up, if the system is ready in place. To your question of, if they've been practicing this, you would have that available. It happens on a continuous basis, so it is constantly scouring and looking throughout the environment in the same way a bad guy would be sitting in your network dwelling and constantly looking out. It does that in very much the exact same way.
So Brian, I guess you'll have that information up front, and then I guess on the forensic side, you can have forensic folks who are looking at logs and looking to see where the bad guys may have gotten into. So
if you need those forensic guys, right? Because these systems can real time, feed the information that you need. And I think it really changes that narrative with the regulator. If you are in fact reporting voluntarily or otherwise, or with your customer or contractually with a third party or with the insurance provider, and changing that narrative, right, is key, because here's what happens, right? You get breached. You are the victim. There's no question you're the victim. But the regulators don't view you that way, right? Because the regulator can't go after the hacker, the bad party, right? The person that actually caused the situation. So they go after the company that they are regulating. And what happens is, instead of being the victim in that scenario, right, you turn out to be the party that somehow negligently or otherwise allowed information to leave the organization. But if you're emboldened with proper, mechanisms in place, and now you can approach that regulator and voluntarily, report that incident in a way that keeps you in that victim, category, right? The regulator now can sympathize with you, whereas, without that information, without being enabled with it, you're not the victim, right? It's very difficult for them to sympathize with you if you had the ability to have these systems in place to ensure that that data wasn't stolen, right? So if you do have those systems in place, and now you're coming in and saying, hey, we did what we needed to do, or even reporting to your customers and saying, there was a breach. We're telling you, informing you about this breach, but guess what? We're your heroes. As we told you, we're going to ensure that your information that you, you entrust us with, we will do what we need to do to ensure the integrity of that information. We have held up our end of the bargain. So, it's a confidence game.
That kind of phone call into a regulator would be welcomely unique, because normally you're coming in and you're going, look, it's been 72 hours. We're just trying to get our arms around it. That 9 times out of 10, the regulator wants to know, well, how many New Yorkers they involved, or how many Californian, or how many, right? And they want to know because in their head they're thinking, oh, the number is really 10 times that much. They don't even know at this point, right? So you're just trying to get a glimpse, and you're already thinking in your head, these guys need a follow-up call because it's going to take them at least a week to get any meaningful answers. But I don't want to let it go too long. But to get a call where you say, we actually had all our PII encrypted. There are no New Yorkers whose data apparently is left. We're still looking around. But if you want, we'll call you back in a few days. But believe me, the regulator, if they believe you, is like, wow, great, that's awesome. Maybe I don't even need another phone call. these people sound like that guy. So you just say like, hey, if you find out something really happened that we should know about, give us a call. But otherwise, you know, mazel tov, because you know, the regulator can often take some pride in that they've been encouraging that kind of technology in response. And here's someone who did it. So yeah, I mean, you almost want to like run a commercial of it.
Well, and that's key. I'll tell you, going through an incident, no matter what side of the table you're on, is exceptionally stressful. And for some people, it's going to be their first time. Some of it won't be, but I'll tell you, it's tough. So if you can change the narrative, flip it from a breach to an incident, that would be welcome. So that's fantastic. Thank you, Patrick. Dimitri, I do have a question that came in for you. So we mentioned a little bit about keys. So like we were talking about, we can prove where keys were, if they weren't engaged or used and things like that. Can you give us a run through on that and key splitting and all the things that we're kind of sidebar referring to?
So every file gets its own TPS report, which is then faxed to, no, wait, that's not what we do. For those of you who are Office fans, like I am, Office Space, TPS reports. But there's some similarity there, which is why, you know, I jokingly raise it. But without a comma, by design, there is no central key store. There is no key rotation. There is no way to obtain the entirety of the key, except for when an actual file is decrypted. So if you have an adversary lurking on a network and you've opened up a file and you've actually decrypted it, yeah, the adversary can see that one file. But gone without a comma are the days where you can, on a wholesale basis, you know, decrypt everything by virtue of the fact that you've entered your username and password. So because out of comma is untethered, disconnected from the identity and access management controls, right? We don't rely on your permission access rights. What we rely on is split key encryption. So when you're running out of comma and you save a file, or the file is encrypted by virtue of the fact that it has a certain label appended to it based on Experience scanning functionality, it immediately is encrypted. And once it's encrypted with its own AES 256-bit key. And that key is then cut up into component pieces that we call shards. Those shards are in turn distributed on physical devices controlled by the user, right? So if an adversary were to somehow you know, gain access to the network and they started exfiltrating files, right, wholesale, what they would get is the ciphertext version of the file. And that's because the only way for that adversary to actually decrypt any one file is to gain access to a secondary device of an authorized user who also has access to that information. Now think about that attack, right? Most attacks these days are perpetrated by an adversary who is thousands of miles away in a different country. To successfully attack an out of comma user, you would literally need to attack multiple devices of that same user because there's no interoperability of key shards. So I'm not going to say it's impossible, but the ROI to the adversary and the ability to actually execute such an attack where they not only are able to hack into the network, into a user's machine, but they also simultaneously have to hack into that user's secondary device, which tends to be a mobile phone. Again, not impossible, but extraordinarily unlikely, right? So what you can demonstrate to a regulator with the keys is the fact that there's never a situation, there's no central key store, right? So the architecture of the software is distributed keys. And by virtue of distributing those keys, if everything was wholesale exfiltrated, there's nothing that the adversary can do with that information unless they have a backdoor to AES 256, in which case, globally, the whole world is in trouble. So you can categorically demonstrate to the regulator or whomever you need to demonstrate to that there is no central key store. And that, again, you know, talk about changing the narrative, that does change the narrative tremendously because you're not encrypting at, you know, a server level, right? And anyone who says they're encrypting, you know, the server, you know, I asked the question, when was the last time that server was actually offline? Right, we're living in a 247, 365 environment where everyone's working remote at different times of the day. Servers are not encrypted. Databases are not encrypted, right? you could be using TDE or something like that, but at the end of the day, someone's able to access that information. So instead of having that central key store or some mechanism where the keys can be infiltrated by the adversary without a comma, we completely change that attack surface.
Gotcha. So another one came in. We're going to do one more this session, just a quick question, and then we'll actually open up the Q&A to a little bit more of the, we'll call it spirited items, right? Some of the stuff that may need to get edited later, depending on how awake everybody is. Gabe, so this one kind of comes in really talking about what are some of the tools that are out there for automatic identification, finding, and mapping of data. You know, obviously we have a soft spot for Spirion because of everything it does. So I don't know if you can kind of talk to a couple other pieces out there. You know, obviously we're not trying to do a broad scope, but I do want to take a minute to kind of talk about why Spirion and basically why I like Spirion, you know, from the broad scope.
Absolutely. So I'll start with a little bit of history. There actually used to be a couple of open source free tools that existed. One of them, I think, might still be maintained by the original university that created the technology. And it actually has a bit of an intersection with Spirion's founding, in so much that the original creator of the Cornell Spider tool had reached out to Spirion years ago for help in kind of retiring that tool and using ours, in particular because some of those solutions suffered from some problems that you might understand quite innately. They were leveraging basic regexes, et cetera, to pattern matching to find data. Today, you fast forward, and there are other solutions both on the market, not nearly as many that certainly none I can think of that are free. I mentioned the Cornell Spider one. I want to say it's still around and actually maintained by an individual there, but kind of more of a passion project, if you would. What you will find out there today are a couple of things. You'll find a lot of very specialized technologies for looking in specific areas. So, for example, AWS has Macy, which is designed to be part of a tool chain kit where you can tie it in if you're building an application to specifically look at S3 buckets and basically give you a yes, no, there's something in here that might be sensitive. You find a lot of point products that are, again, kind of designed to look within their own environment. One of the things Spirion does is to do a couple of things. It bridges all of those areas where you will have investments in your data storing and where your sensitive information may live. So again, whether that's on premise or in the cloud or a NAS device, Windows server, laptops, Mac, Windows, Linux, etc. So we kind of bridge that gap, but we also bridge that across with a common methodology that is time-tested, mother-proven, if you would, a very high degree of accuracy across all those, so that what you're actually doing is that when you are identifying sensitive information in any of those locations, you're doing so with consistency throughout the environment. But again, if what you have is a very specific need to say all you wanted to do was find an account number inside of web logs, then maybe using something like a SIM product might suffice for that one very specific nature. But there are lots of things that will basically find a data type in a specific location, depending on what the use case there is.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm actually going to open up to the official Q&A session. I know we've got a little bit of time left, but this way people can ask questions that may be a little more pertinent to their organization or to their own clients. For some of our attendees that come from a legal background or service provider background, there's a lot there. So this is where we're going to cut it off for everyone else. It's been a pleasure talking with everyone, and we're going to go ahead and open the doors to the private Q&A. So thank you, everyone. So let's go ahead and we'll take a moment, and then we'll go ahead and get into the Q&A.